What happens when you mix Armored Core's arena mode with the far-flung ancient worlds of a series like Final Fantasy? Or better yet, throw in the aesthetic of From Software's older fantasy titles. You'd likely end up with something like Frame Gride. And yes, I said Frame Gride, not Frame Grid. The reason behind this, as far as I can tell, comes from the Japanese katakana rendering of grid. At least, that's my assumption. And well, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Feel free to correct me in the comments below. Now, if you're one of my longtime viewers, you might be thinking, hey, hasn't he covered this one before? And yes, I have. To be completely honest, I'm currently juggling several much larger games, and I thought this would be the perfect time to revisit something I feel I didn't give enough attention to the first time around. This time, I played the game roughly 6 times longer than before to get a more rounded opinion and share with you what I think of it now. Besides, Frame Gride is a game that just doesn't get that much coverage, and that's largely due to its status as a Japanese exclusive for the Sega Dreamcast. Unfortunately, that console holds a bit of a sour spot for many North American gamers, a fact that hasn't helped Frame Gride gain any recognition. And before any of you make your assumptions and think I'm hating on the system, well, I'm not. The Dreamcast is awesome. It's one of those consoles I wish had a longer lifespan, much like its predecessor, the Sega Saturn. But history is history, and here we are. Like the Saturn, the Dreamcast library includes some absolute gems that were never localized for the West. For many of us, that means either fumbling through text we can't understand, or hoping for a fan translation to make these titles accessible. It's a shame really, because some of the best games ever made for the system were designed with Japanese audiences in mind, where, incidentally, the Dreamcast thrived. Thankfully, Frame Gride has been given new life thanks to a fan translation by Lucas Milu. This translation represents a serious investment of time and effort, making the game about 100% playable for English-speaking audiences. Now, I can't tell you exactly where I got my copy. Let's just say I happened to find myself sailing the high seas one day and stumbled upon a pirate's ransom of gaming treasures. Suffice to say, it's obvious that I should keep those details vague.
That's got to be the best pirate I've ever seen.
So what is Frame Gride about? Well, would you believe me if I told you that it doesn't really matter? The game's opening paragraph and manual blurbs are basically there to establish why a bunch of mystical looking machines are trying to break each other into pieces. However, it wouldn't be right to exclude the story for those who are interested. Do note that some of the names aren't the same in the translated version as they are in the manual, and can sometimes differ in the few walkthroughs that people have posted over the years. This is largely due to how Japanese is structured and how translators often add flourishes to make the text more understandable in English. With that in mind, here's the storyline as mentioned in a translated version of the manual by D. McDonald, which can still be found on GameFAQs to this day. Upon the death of Emperor Regilo, chaos was unleashed when Margrave Volt fomented a rebellion that plunged the entire continent into the flames of a harsh and bloody war. The other 6 rulers of the empire, each one a candidate for the now vacant imperial throne, joined forces and recklessly confronted the 9 divisions of knights led by Lord Zolt. The result, a victory for the Margrave's forces. It was simply a matter of time before the empire would fall into ruin. The citizens of the empire fervently prayed for a final successor, a true inheritor of the imperial crown. It was for that purpose that the Archbishop Melange existed. Though he was aged and bedridden, the Archbishop had been informed of the return of a lone knight just before this unprecedented crisis came to light. I bestow upon thee the honorable title of Knight of the Realm. Thou shalt submit to our guidance and wield thy sword with great skill. And even in the most distant lands, it shall be known that thou art as one with the armored giants. The manual also gives the Frame Gride units several names, stating under the subheading that they are ancient weapons excavated from long-abandoned ruins. They are commonly called Cavaliers or armored giants. It really seems like someone just wanted to keep the term Frame Gride because they thought it sounded cool. This description also contradicts the in-game mechanics, where parts for these machines are crafted using jewels. But maybe they just meant the frames. Honestly, it's pretty confusing if you think too hard about it. My guess is that this might be one of those games where the story was tacked on during the final stages of development. Lucas Milo's translation also sort of tells the same story, but it has virtually no bearing on anything except for mentioning Zolt, who is also referred to as Zeidlanel in the game. This might be a From Software game, but it's really not one of those cases where the NPCs, items, and environments do the talking, something we all know they're famous for. While there are some nice looking environments, albeit a bit nauseating as is the case with the Vane Palace, there aren't any NPCs or item descriptions. This is likely because the game was clearly meant to build on Armored Core's very popular arena mode, bringing it to a different generation of players. At its core, no pun intended, this is an expanded version of that concept. I want to say that From Software might have been testing the waters with the Dreamcast, seeing if the Armored Core formula would take off there. However, Armored Core 2 was released on the PlayStation 2 in 2000, the following year. If anything, it feels like they might have just wanted to use some of the framework from that game to make this concept work. Alternatively, they may have also been using Frame Gride to gauge how players would respond to a more melee-focused combat system for ACs. Really though, I keep comparing the two games because Frame Gride and Armored Core are very much similar. They share the same basic mechanics for controlling and customizing mechs, putting them in one-on-one skirmishes within arenas. The key difference is that the entirety of Frame Gride is built around the arena concept, just with a fantasy twist. Instead of climbing a ladder, you're traveling to various fantasy locales on a small island, fighting other Frame Gride mechs to grind for jewels, all in hopes of assembling a machine capable of defeating the game's incredibly difficult final boss. The combat system has been expanded to include magical abilities, melee combos, and summoning squires, all of which I'll explain in a minute. Some of these moves are clearly borrowed from the Armored Core series and repurposed with different sprites, but you can't tell me that launching a volley of magic birds at my enemies isn't identical to firing a volley of missiles in Armored Core. Cannon-like weapons and range weapons are also very similar, although the firing mechanics of the latter have been tweaked a little bit. Now, to get to the combat and abilities of this game, they're undeniably cool to look at and satisfying to pull off. However, the way these moves are built around what is clearly Armored Core's control scheme leaves a lot to be desired. All of your movement and the camera are exactly the same as in Armored Core 2. You can even strafe. The thumbstick moves the camera around but is overall absolutely useless. You navigate using the D-pad, which can be physically painful if you're not used to it. The face buttons let you fire, slash, and block, seemingly simple enough, but that wouldn't be very engaging for the 4 to 5 hour experience that Frame Gride presents itself as. So the developers crammed in a load of functionality that, if I'm being honest, is a little hard to get used to. Firstly, when you get close to an enemy, your ranged attacks automatically change to close range punches. You have no control over this, it's by design and you have to adapt. To do anything beyond basic moves, you need to hold down several face buttons to execute various actions. This includes summoning sprites, companions you can create by combining jewels. If you want to gain an edge in later battles, summoning these is practically essential. You'll also need to hold down both shoulder buttons and then input specific button combinations to perform punch and sword combos or advanced blocking moves. These moves and abilities are entirely dependent on the parts you have equipped on your mech, but they all function in a very similar way, allowing you to learn the ins and outs through a bit of trial and error. The big problem is that playing Frame Gride can absolutely wreck your hand. While the Dreamcast excelled at hosting great fighting games, those typically operated on a 2D plane. Here you're dealing with full 3D movement while using what essentially amounts to tank controls for turning and looking around with the D-pad. All of this is compounded by the challenge of fighting highly mobile enemies paired with genuinely terrible AI. Often, opposing combatants don't seem to know how to use the tools available to them. They'll sometimes jump around erratically, barely accomplishing anything. The main difficulty of the game ends up being your struggle to hit them, as they mimic the Armored Core approach of spamming ranged attacks. The problem is that this game's combat system isn't fully optimized for ranged combat, leading to awkward encounters where the AI seems to expect moves you're not aiming to perform. Even the final match against Zolt, or Zeidlanel, depending on the translation, is more frustrating than satisfying, as he mostly wanders around dishing out extremely overpowered AoE attacks that seemingly come out of nowhere. The developers did attempt to mitigate some of these frustrations by allowing you to craft and summon the aforementioned squires. These are essentially drones designed to assist you in battle. Each squire specializes in a single type of attack and follows specific movement patterns that can sometimes prove useful. Surprisingly, there is a decent variety of these companions, with some later designs featuring that shiny, reflective texture often used in older games to imply metallic surfaces. Squires range from floating turrets to mine droppers to full-on attackers equipped with strong weaponry and elemental abilities. However, there's a glaring oversight in their implementation. Your own attacks can harm or even destroy your own squires. Worse yet, they can also damage each other. This oversight can lead to incredibly aggravating moments, such as when you finally manage to corner an enemy frame only for your squire to intervene and get caught in your melee combo. This flaw is especially frustrating because squires are crafted using jewels, an extremely important and limited resource in the game. And that brings me to another long-standing issue with Frame Gride: grinding. Now, I don't inherently mind grinding in games. It can sometimes be enjoyable or help players like me better understand the mechanics, but grinding in fighting games, that's a different story. It's especially frustrating in fighting games that lack the variety needed to justify repetitive encounters against the same enemies. Unfortunately, Frame Gride is exactly that. While the game features a wealth of parts and squires to craft, obtaining the jewels required to make them becomes a tedious slog, especially after reaching the final boss. Fighting opponents for a second time means grinding out battles in the town arena repeatedly, with a moveset extremely similar to when you began, often for as little as 1 jewel per fight. To make matters worse, jewels drops are random, and you never really know what you're going to get. Even guides available online aren't entirely certain about what the drop mechanics are, leaving you to grind for an RNG chance of obtaining the jewels you need. Thankfully, the game does provide a list of jewel combinations for crafting, so at least you'll know what you're aiming for once you have the materials. However, that doesn't really spare you from the tedium of obtaining them. The customization in Frame Gride is relatively solid, though it doesn't bring much to the table that wasn't already seen in the original Armored Core. The system features stats that govern attack strength, speed, energy consumption for special moves, defenses, and LF, a stat I assume stands for Life Force. LF determines the squires you can equip and essentially acts like Armored Core's weight values, though it's specifically tied to how many and which squires you can bring into battle. Your starting Frame Gride, or Armored Giant or Cavalier, is determined by your personality quiz, reminiscent of fantasy RPGs like Dragon Quest III. Depending on your answers, you'll begin with either a light, medium, or heavy frame. The differences between these types are pretty straightforward. Light frames are fast but agile, heavy frames are tanky but slow, and medium frames offer a balance of both. I personally went with a medium frame for this playthrough, not because it's my usual choice, I tend to favor fast strikers, but to mix things up for this video. While you're tactically able to build a variety of setups, all moves function as different versions of the same basic actions. This diminishes the value of experimentation since you're likely to focus on maximizing stats or equipping better squires rather than exploring alternative designs. The crafting system compounds this issue. Because you're often working towards specific upgrades or replacements, you're unlikely to waste resources experimenting with suboptimal parts. As a result, many of the game's more interesting designs and configurations end up being ignored, sidelined by the obvious need to stick to efficient choices. Now, the developers attempted to add an element of unpredictability to the system, likely to get the player to try a little more. Parts can break during battles, whether on your mech or the enemy's. If a part breaks, it's gone. You need to craft it again. This mechanic forces you to adapt by using or assembling parts you might not have otherwise considered. However, it also means more grinding. Losing a key part means heading back to the grind to recraft it, which can be a frustrating and time-consuming process. Adding to the chaos of this whole system, neither you or your enemies can target a specific part in this game. As a result, the parts that get destroyed are often completely random, further complicating your strategy and potentially derailing your build entirely. Visually, Frame Gride is brimming with an imaginative touch that is impossible to miss. The arenas may fall into the usual fantasy staples, caves, sprawling fortresses, ancient ruins, but there's a level of detail here that elevates them beyond the ordinary. Take the underwater castle for instance. Faint beams of light cut through murky depths, casting an ethereal glow that makes the whole place feel like something pulled from a lost myth. Or the floating, very nauseating sky ruins, suspended in an endless sea of clouds, streaked with sunlight that gives them a sense of age and wonder. For the Dreamcast, these environments really pop. Textures, lighting, and atmospheric effects combine to give each battle a cinematic weight. It's not just an arena, it feels like a piece of a world, a glimpse into a larger history. The desolate candle halls and crumbling statues even seem to echo with the lives of those who once filled them, while the sunken fortress whispers of forgotten disasters. Every location feels like it carries scars of the past, adding depth even when the game itself really doesn't. But that's where even more frustration comes in. These arenas are begging for a narrative, some kind of context to match their grandeur. What caused the ruins to float endlessly in the sky? What tragedy turned the underwater castle into a ghostly relic? The game never gives answers anywhere, and while that leaves room for imagination, it also highlights a missed opportunity. A few narrative threads could have made these locations unforgettable, tying the grand visuals to a world that feels alive. Instead, we're left with arenas that look incredible but sit hollow, teasing at the kind of immersion the game could have achieved. Frame Gride's Cavaliers, call them mechs, armored giants, or whatever else suits you, stand as some of the most imaginative creations to ever emerge from Software. Imaginative being the operative word here. Let's not pretend these designs rival the fine, mechanically intricate detailing seen in their other work. Instead, what Frame Gride does is far more daring, and dare I say, a little rare. It marries the ethereal, otherworldly beauty of fantasy with the cold, utilitarian edge of science fiction. Crafting magical mechs, armored frames imbued with mysticism as much as metal isn't something easily pulled off. But Frame Gride makes it feel seamless. Yes, anime like Knights and Magic may tread similar ground, and yes, I own it on Blu-ray, but Frame Gride's approach to this fusion is uniquely its own. What's particularly striking is the consistency in these designs. Modular cores, knightly flourishes, and ornamental details work together in a way that feels purposeful rather than flashy. These Cavaliers look like they belong, artifacts of a world where magic and machinery coexist naturally. This harmony owes much to the design philosophy born in Armored Core, where the core acts as both a mechanical foundation and a visual centerpiece. Frame Gride adopts and reshapes that idea into something befitting of its high fantasy aesthetic, proving that the modularity of Armored Core can be adapted into entirely different realms. And really, none of this should be a surprise considering the talent behind the game. Kenichiro Tsukuda, the producer who steered Armored Core 2, Armored Core 3, and Daemon X Machina, brought his expertise to Frame Gride. Masayuki Sato, the programmer on Armored Core and Project Phantasma, did the same. The Armored Core DNA is unmistakable, not just in how the Cavaliers look, but in how they feel, move, and clash in battle. Frame Gride doesn't just wear its lineage on its sleeve, it thrives on it, distilling the spirit of Armored Core and painting it with the sweeping brushstrokes of knights, castles, and legend. Frame Gride's music comes courtesy of Kota Hashino, a composer whose name is etched into gaming history. If you've ever played Echo Knight, Shadow Tower, the Armored Core series, or even Dark Souls, you've heard this genius in action. Heck, even Sekiro and Elden Ring owe some of their musical identity to him. And then there's The Adventures of Cookies and Cream. He did that, and honestly, I hadn't thought about that game in, well, years. With credentials like that, you'd expect Frame Gride to boast a soundtrack that's nothing short of phenomenal. A score that wraps itself around the game's magical mechs and medieval battlefields like a second skin. But it doesn't. In fact, this might just be the most forgettable work of Hoshino's career. Not because it's outright bad, but because it's just completely uninspired. This isn't the Kota Hashino you remember, the one who blends experimentation with atmosphere, creating soundscapes that feel vast and alien as the worlds they inhabit. No, Frame Gride feels like the result of going through the motions. The music does exactly what's expected and absolutely nothing more. It's functional, sure, but functionality isn't the kind of legacy Hoshino is known for. Instead, we're left with a soundtrack that is just forgettable, passable, and frankly, probably a footnote in an otherwise extraordinary career. Frame Gride is, without a doubt, an unusual and unique title. It's hard to find any game that merges the mechanical depth of Armored Core with the ethereal grandeur of a fantasy setting. The blend of sci-fi modularity and medieval aesthetics sets it apart, and part of me can't help but wish it found more success. Maybe if it had been released just a few years later, when online gaming on consoles was starting to gain traction, things could have been different. Yes, Frame Gride did include online play, a forward-thinking feature for its time, but it was a bit too early for its own good. Even though online games existed on this and even the Sega Saturn, the infrastructure just wasn't there yet for consoles to fully embrace the idea, whether in Japan or the US. And trying to get this game online today, well, it pretty much results in a crash. Revisiting this game has been a real treat though. It's one of those titles that stands as a testament to a very specific era of gaming. An era where risks were taken, even if the audience wasn't quite ready for them. Games like Frame Gride were rare in 1999 and they're practically non-existent today. That's what makes this one so special, even with its quirks, limitations, and flaws. But what about you? Have you played Frame Gride before? Or are you considering checking it out? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I'm Kei-Nova, wishing you health, safety, and a little joy in these challenging times.